So we'll now move on to Amelia Cooper, who is going to speak about the situation in Lesvos. She's currently volunteering with Legal Centre Lesvos, who have filed a complaint with the European Court about the unlawful pushbacks from Greece to Turkey. So she's going to speak both about that and to probably, I hope, give us an update on what's happening with the new camp that's been set up after the burning of the previous Moria camp. So over to you, please, Amelia.
Hi everyone, thank you Wendy for that introduction, and thanks also Omar for your contribution. For me it's really important to underline how what I'm going to be talking about today, both with the policies that we're witnessing on land and at sea in the Aegean, are orchestrated, facilitated, financially and politically supported by the same EU that is carrying out the operations in the central Mediterranean. I think often we see Italy and Greece as two quite separate spaces, but I hope that through this panel and through the contributions that we're making, we'll be able to see the commonalities in the mindset and the policies that are being pursued. So, as Wendy said, I work with the Legal Centre Lesvos. I'm here in Lesvos at the moment, and we provide free legal aid to migrants on the island and engage in broader advocacy and strategic litigation to defend and advance migrant rights. The first thing that I'll talk about today, as Wendy mentioned, is the situation here in Lesvos, particularly in the aftermath of the fires that destroyed the former Moria camp. And to begin that, I think we should recognise what Moria was. And the former Moria camp was a symbol of the EU's commitment to containment and deterrence of migrants, and the aftermath of the fires has shown that this remains the region's default position, both in its policies and its practices. So while EU Commissioner Johansson was promising that there would be no more Morias, a new containment camp was already being built here in Lesvos. Closed centres were being or have been constructed across 3 Aegean islands, and the EU's Migration Pact both expanded and made mandatory the use of border procedures. So the fires that tore through the camp on the 8th and 9th of September were followed by a week in which migrants fleeing were trapped between riot police barricades. They were sleeping on the roadside, they were prevented from reaching the island's main town, and they were denied access to adequate food, water, sanitation facilities, shelter, or healthcare. They were frequently subjected to tear gas at the hands of riot police, which caused respiratory infections in infants who were just a few weeks old. Protests by the community calling for freedom as opposed to encampment were forcibly repressed by the state, and those same people were then moved by police units into the new camp. That movement into the new camp was backed also by this Orwellian messaging that was telling migrants not to trust information from anyone apart from the Greek state, and threatening them that if they were not to move into the new camp, their asylum procedures would be discontinued. The new camp was built in about 10 days following the fires by the Greek state with the support of the European Union financially and the material support of UNHCR and other NGOs. There were no guarantees during its construction of whether it would be a temporary site, whether it would be a closed camp, or if it would be something in between. Now, the new camp is built on a really exposed piece of land. It's right next to the sea. It's in a kind of basin. There's hills on 2 sides of it. And the inclement weather that we've been having in Lesvos recently has already flooded the camp twice. Despite the preponderance of humanitarian logos on every tent, this is yet another example of the state's abject failure to ensure even the most basic conditions for a dignified life. People have been living inside the new camp for over a month now, and there are still no showers. People are washing themselves with bottled water or in the sea. People are living in tents which are pitched directly on the floor, or they're sleeping in rub halls which are hosting hundreds of people. Access to legal aid actors isn't guaranteed, and residents are subjected to curfews. They're only allowed out between 8 and 8 and not usually on Sundays. But this whole situation is not shocking. This is eminently predictable. The response of the EU, the Greek state, and these certain non-governmental organisations has not changed despite the visceral proof that the fires provided of how untenable their positions are. But away from this media circus that's been surrounding the new camp, there's another aspect of European migration policy, which sits at the intersection of both invisibilized and hypervisible. It's something that's known very easily among migrant communities, but which is deliberately obscured by the Greek state and by European institutions. And those are the ongoing collective expulsions in the Aegean. So thanks again to Omar for the work that you've done and the framing that you've provided. I think it's really important here to recall the framing of this population and the targeting of them based on where they are as opposed to who they are. And I'll speak now on the change in modus operandi that we've seen in the pushbacks since March of this year. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the context, on the 1st of March, the Greek state that announced that it would suspend the right to seek asylum, it violently fortified its land and its sea borders. The use of live fire was permitted, and at least 2 migrants were killed at the northern land border with Evros. I'm based on Lesvos, so I'm only going to talk about the expulsions that we've seen happening in the Aegean Sea, but it's worth recalling that this practice is not isolated, it's not exclusive to here. As Omar said, it's rampant throughout the central Mediterranean, but it's also happening on land borders throughout Europe as well. So, since March, the frequency and visibility of violent pushbacks has increased dramatically. I'm sure many of you have seen the reports, the investigations, the reconstructions based on video and testimony from survivors of pushbacks that show unquestionably that the Hellenic Coast Guard is systematically expelling migrants, abandoning them on motorless life rafts at sea. The legal centre has been in contact with more than 40 survivors of at least 18 different expulsions, for which we confirm the dates and locations. But these survivors have frequently experienced far more than just one expulsion. It's not uncommon to be contacted by someone who's experienced 6, 7, 8 types of these expulsions, both on land and at sea. But the nature and repetition of these abuses sometimes makes it difficult to get the precise information about each space, each date, etc. So in the Aegean here, expulsions can largely be characterized in 2 ways. There are those which happen exclusively at sea, and those which happen after an arrival to one of the Greek islands. The cases that we've followed are split roughly equally between the 2, and there are common practices to both. But I think something that's worth underscoring is that both are illegal and both fall squarely into Greek jurisdiction. For those who are intercepted at sea, migrants frequently report that there's the presence of a larger Greek authority vessel and then the deployment of a smaller, faster boat, which approaches and menaces their dinghy. This usually takes the form of attacking the motor, removing the gasoline tank, or piercing the rubber. In other occasions, we've seen the use of larger vessels to create dangerous waves that would push the migrant boat back towards Turkish waters. On several occasions, authorities have then forced themselves upon the dinghy and attached a rope to it, which is then joining it to this fast boat, and towed the migrant vessel back towards Turkish waters. On others, migrants have been instructed to board the authority vessel, often with the false information that they'll be transferred to Athens or elsewhere, and they're then driven out to sea and subsequently subjected to an expulsion using one of these orange life rafts. For those who manage to reach a Greek island, there are, like I said, similarities in the pushback practice, but a difference here is that it implicates a far broader range of authorities. So beyond just the Coast Guard, you also have the participation of local police forces, you have the problem of having to identify spaces in which migrants can be held. Every survivor of a collective expulsion after being on land reported to us that they were subjected to arbitrary detention from a period of a few hours to a few days. Usually they were held in unofficial detention sites, so port buildings and warehouses, often without access to food, water or sanitation facilities, and of course much less the ability to register their claim for asylum, explain their protection concerns, or articulate any urgent healthcare needs. Their personal possessions, including cell phones, identity documents, and often large sums of money, are usually confiscated, and migrants are then transferred from this unofficial detention space, again, onto one of these authority vessels, driven out to sea, and then forced onto the now notorious orange life rafts. There's a few things to underscore here. And the first is that from the multiple testimonies that we've received, which concern, like I said, at least 18 different expulsions across different spaces in the Aegean, have testimonies that corroborate each other so closely that it strongly suggests that there's a standard modus operandi here. For example, multiple survivors have informed us that while they were on this larger vessel being driven out to sea, Greek authorities instructed them to sit in the brace position with their heads down, with the threat of being hit in the face with a police baton if they were to look up. Others were subjected to physical violence, whether while boarding the ship or ultimately when they were forced from the ship onto the life raft below. And this last aspect is particularly egregious. People have been forced or thrown from a height of approximately 3 meters onto an inflatable life raft below. This is often out of the view of the people that they're traveling with, whether that's family members or other parts of the group, in a situation that is broadly reminiscent of a mock execution. It's worth noting that the people who are being subjected to these, like this, being thrown off the ship in this way, include minors, they include infants, they include people with visible physical disabilities. And while on some of those cases, visibly vulnerable migrants, so I'm talking about amputees, wheelchair users, small children, may be given life vests, no such precautions are taken for the broader population. Every survivor that we have spoken to was ultimately left adrift in open water on an inflatable life raft or on a damaged dinghy. And these are not isolated events, these are a systematic practice. For those of you who aren't familiar with the geography here, and I'm sure Sean will be able to speak in more detail about it than me, but from Lesvos, Turkey is not far. From the Aegean Islands, Turkey is broadly visible. You can practically count the buildings on the shoreline. It's a very narrow stretch of water, but it is intensely surveyed. It's not only the Hellenic Coast Guard who are present here, but there are vessels belonging to NATO's standing maritime force. Specifically at the moment, there's a ship flagged by the German Navy, and Frontex. Both NATO and Frontex have been implicated in these collective expulsions. So in March, the Danish contingent of Frontex publicly reported that they refused an instruction to participate in a collective expulsion. They were told to tow a migrant boat out of Greek waters and refused to do so. And yesterday, an investigation by several journalists and research groups placed them at or near at least 6 pushbacks since March. The German flagged NATO ship, which I mentioned just now, has also admitted in Parliament to witnessing at least 3 different collective expulsions. On one of these occasions, the NATO ship not only witnessed the unlawful disabling of this migrant boat, but subsequently observed the dinghy in distress for several hours without engaging in a rescue. Collective expulsions of these nature are in clear violation of migrants' rights. The right to life is protected by Article 2, the right to be free from torture, cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment under Article 3, the right to be free from arbitrary detention as per Article 5, and Wendy, as you touched on the right to family reunification before, I think it's worth noting as well that many of the people crossing, who are then removed from European territory, are removed from the ability to lodge an application for family reunification. We would further follow Omar in arguing that the widespread and systematic nature of this practice constitutes a crime against humanity. Yet, despite all of this evidence, the national and regional response has fundamentally failed to hold responsible authorities to account. Greek government officials veer between denial of the collective expulsions to celebration of their effective maritime controls in preventing migrant arrivals. European officials have called for greater monitoring, as if this is some kind of panacea. But as I said, we have 2 monitoring vessels here, and both of them have been directly implicated in the pushbacks themselves. This isn't a question of a lack of information, this is a question of facilitation by complicity. The President of the European Commission herself stated that she has no capacity to initiate an inquiry into this, and thereby shifted the responsibility for both the practice and the prospects of accountability away from European institutions. When Greece suspended the right to seek asylum back in March and violently fortified its borders, the European Commission hailed Greece as the shield of Europe. The Evros region, where many of the land borders take place, where many of the land expulsions take place from Greece to Turkey, and where migrants are frequently stripped and humiliated before being returned to Turkey, was held up in the press conference regarding the new migration pact as a successful example of border management. The collective expulsions in the Aegean are not isolated, and they're not only Greek policy. They're facilitated by and they're consistent with European policies and priorities. I know that I'm approaching the end of my speaking time now, so perhaps we can speak more about potential remedies in the Q&A. It's worth noting that we have filed applications with the European Court of Human Rights, which are awaiting their decisions on admissibility. But given the speed of the court, I don't expect a swift answer. And we've joined 28 other organisations in calling for an inquiry by the Greek Parliament, which again has fallen silent. But something to note with expulsions is their very nature removes survivors' access to remedies, okay? So they're not only being removed from Greek territory, but they're also being subjected to things like their cell phones being confiscated. And with that, the evidence that they had of being in Greece, so GPS locations, videos, photos, etc. Upon their return to Turkey, they're frequently subjected to prolonged periods of detention, which then make it difficult to sustain contact with them. So you have a practice here which not only subjects these individuals to the most egregious violations of their rights, but then deliberately limits their capacity for seeking remedy as well. So I'll stop for now to not take anyone else's speaking time. But if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Amelia, for detailing the horrific situation in the Mediterranean, and we'll hopefully talk a bit more at the end about what remedies are available and what can be done.